very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we should be looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and nobody will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is Claire Pearsall, Conservative councillor and former government special advisor. And here's what we've got coming up on the show. The much anticipated report into Downing Street lockdown parties is due to be published any time now, but with much of the detail withheld, how bad can the fallout be? And are police wasting too much time on hate crimes and hurt feelings and spending too little time on burglaries and keeping communities safe? We'll explore two high-profile cases. That's what we're talking about for the next hour, but what do you need to talk about? You can email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet me @gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date in the GB News newsroom. Downing Street says it will publish the Sue Gray report into alleged lockdown parties this afternoon. A pared-back version has been submitted to the Prime Minister. Number 10 hasn't confirmed that it will make the full report public after police finish their own investigations. Boris Johnson will make a statement on the findings in the Commons at 3:30. We'll bring you that statement here. A senior Conservative MP says he'll also address the Conservative Party at 6:30 this evening. Well, earlier, when questioned about his denials of any wrongdoing, the Prime Minister stuck to what he said in the past.
We're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the. You're going to have to wait and see the outcome of the investigations. But of course, I stick absolutely to what I've said in the past. But I'm here to talk about the free ports that we're doing around the UK, and what they are also doing. What they are also doing. What I stick in complete. You have to wait and see what the investigations. And with all due respect.
The government is expected to announce a U-turn over compulsory COVID vaccines for NHS workers. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid is reportedly going to scrap the policy over fears it could lead to a major staffing crisis. He's due to make a statement in the Commons later. The Prime Minister will travel to Kiev tomorrow for crisis talks with the Ukrainian president. Boris Johnson's trip will follow a phone call with the Russian president this afternoon. He's already warned that it would be a disaster for Russia if it invades Ukraine. The government's also due to unveil new measures, making it easier to sanction Russian interests, a move Moscow has described as alarming. More than 45,000 homes are without power after back-to-back storms hit the UK over the weekend. Most of those affected are in Scotland. Network Rail says train services are also being disrupted by trees that have fallen. Residents in Tyne and Wear say they're shocked by how much damage the storms caused.
You would never ever think in a million years that would happen, especially weight of stone. But it shows you how strong wind is.
Trees down, gable end down, Sion Terrace is gone.
We've been in the northeast, we've just come to get used to it really, but these last few years the weather seems to be just getting worse and worse.
A British woman who was found guilty of lying about being gang raped in Cyprus has had her conviction overturned. The woman, who's now 21, was given a 4-month suspended sentence in 2020 for public mischief after withdrawing her allegation. The Supreme Court of Cyprus found she'd not been given a fair trial. New evidence shows the suspect in the Madeleine McCann investigation worked at the holiday apartments in Portugal shortly before the 3-year-old disappeared in 2007. A documentary airing tonight on German TV reveals the 44-year-old convicted paedophile, known as Christian B, carried out repairs at the resort. The man, who's currently in prison for rape, denies any involvement. A Brexit freedoms bill, which the government claims will cut £1 billion of red tape for UK businesses, is going to be brought forward. It affects how EU laws, which were kept for legal continuity after Brexit, are handled. Downing Street says the bill will ensure changes can be made easily and allow the country to capitalise on Brexit freedoms more quickly. Sir Tony Blair and Sir Keir Starmer were among the mourners at the funeral of the Labour MP Jack Dromey today. The leading trade unionist and Harriet Harman's husband was celebrated at St Margaret's Church in Westminster. The former Prime Minister Gordon Brown told those gathered that Jack Dromey had remade history many times over in his career. The father of 3 died aged 73 in his Birmingham constituency earlier this month. Formula One has announced that COVID-19 vaccinations will be mandatory for all staff, with no exceptions. The new season's due to kick off in March with a record 23 races this year. It's understood all current drivers are fully vaccinated, but the rules will also apply to teams, media and hospitality guests as well. Footballer Christian Eriksen has signed for Premier League club Brentford 7 months after suffering a cardiac arrest on the pitch while playing for Denmark. The 29-year-old, who's been fitted with an internal defibrillator, hasn't played since he collapsed at Euro 2020. The former Tottenham midfielder has signed a 6-month deal. You are now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's go back to We Need to Talk About with Alex.
It's Judgment Day. Well, the beginnings of it. As the infamous Sue Gray report into Downing Street's do's and the claims of no, I did nots finally drops. But what was supposed to be a conclusive black and white verdict on the Prime Minister's culpability looks like it will leave a lot of, well, grey areas, with the only black and white in the investigation being vast blocks of redacted text as the Met Police conduct their own digging. As with the unfurling of many a political scandal, a few things, however, are certain. The opposition will cry cover-up unless the report portrays full-scale debauchery, while the Prime Minister's own MPs are poised at the cliff edge like lemmings, waiting to determine whether they should push their leader over the precipice lest they tumble off themselves, nervously surveying the trial by media and subsequent shifts in public opinion to gauge their own future electoral fortunes. It's all a venal pursuit, isn't it? As journalists smack their lips at the prospect of the drama of a vote of no confidence and a leadership contest, the Downing Street spin machine will scramble to pump out distracting baubles, from Brexit bills to talking tough on Ukraine. Strap yourselves in, ladies and gentlemen. The show is about to begin. Well, joining me now from Downing Street is GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood. Tom, what's the latest?
Briefing, that is, members of the parliamentary reporting circle, if you like.
Hi, Tom. Can you hear me?
Update is,
what's the latest goings on? Has the report dropped?
The report has not yet been published, but we are expecting soon to see the very latest, this new stripped-down report. Of course, those 8 events, alleged events, parties perhaps, that happened across Whitehall and in Downing Street are not going to be in full explored in this sort of stripped-down report because they're being investigated by the Metropolitan Police. And of course, on Friday we heard that they cannot be explored lest they prejudice that investigation. So this new stripped-down version of Sue Gray's report landed in number 10 email servers at 11:20 this morning. Now, number 10 have been going through it since then and are going to publish it with good time before the Prime Minister's statement at 3:30 p.m. in the House today. So we're expecting that report very, very soon.
Tom, thank you very much. Do keep us updated and let us know if any whisperings emerge from that building behind you. Well, let's talk now to the Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West, Christine Jardine. Christine, how do you assess the situation for the Prime Minister?
To be completely open and transparent today with the statement. We have to know what is in the report. We don't want to see a heavily redacted or reduced report. It's important for public confidence that the public sees what has happened and to stop this drain away in trust, which we're seeing, which damages us all, the government, the country. It damages us all, the government, the Conservative Party, the country. And, you know, it's time that we had the full report and knew the full circumstances.
There's a risk here, isn't there, that we're not going to get the full report, anything but the full report. We already know that huge tranches have been removed or redacted on request of the Metropolitan Police so as not to prejudice their own investigation. So really, what can we learn from this?
Well, I think, you know, we know that there were parties in Downing Street, and we know that while the public was suffering, the Prime Minister and his staff seemed to be living by a different set of rules to the rest of us. If we're going to have a line drawn upon under this, there has to be some form of restitution for the public, some form of recognition that they haven't been shown proper respect. And frankly, I think it's time the Conservative MPs did the duty to the country, listened to the constituents and sacked Boris Johnson.
If it transpires, however, that there were goings-on in Downing Street, you know, parties and late-night boozy gatherings, yet Boris Johnson himself was not particularly part of those, is it right that the Prime Minister should go, or should heads roll within his immediate team and Boris Johnson stay in place?
The leader sets the tone. I can't remember off the top of my head which American president. I think it was Harry Truman had a sign that said the buck stops here. And that applies to every leader. The buck stops with them. He created the tone. If there were rules broken within Downing Street, it's because that was the culture. And people thought that it was acceptable, that they weren't subject to the same rules as everybody else. And the only person responsible for that is Boris Johnson, because he set the tone, created the culture, and the buck stops with him.
Is there not a risk here that this is becoming rather a media-confected story now, with the constant leaks to the press and, you know, drip, drip, drip of information, some of which has actually been in the public domain for well over a year, but is being sort of lighted upon now as further evidence for this party culture in Downing Street? Do you really think that members of the public are that bothered now? Are they just getting exhausted by it and want the government to move on and focus on actually running the country?
My mailbox is full of complaints from my constituents about the fact that the government haven't been doing that. And the reason the government haven't been doing that is because we've had story after story about the behaviour, contracts which have gone to waste, millions, billions of pounds worth of public money, which has gone to waste or been written off. And the public, yes, they're fed up, but what they're fed up with is having a government that's completely out of touch with what they are going through. We've got a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, and this government seems completely out of touch and unable to stick to the promises that it gave to the British public. We've seen, by-election defeats for them. We won in both Chesham and Amersham and in North Shropshire because people felt that the government that they had elected was not the government that they were seeing now, that what they had been promised was not what they were getting, that the government is out of touch, taking them for granted and thinks it's one rule for all of us in a crisis, but not for them.
Christine, thank you very much for giving me your take on this. Christine Jardine there. Well, joining me now in the studio is the former government special advisor and Conservative councillor Claire Pearsall. Claire, I mean, you've got the ability here to give me an idea of what's being said amongst the grassroots and in Conservative branches, whether Conservative members around the country and councillors like you are up in arms about this or not.
Yeah, there is a lot of anger and it's not going to go away. And I think the report today, or the version of the report that we're going to see, is going to please nobody. And I think this is the situation we're now left with. It's going to be heavily redacted. It may well only tell us what we've already learnt through the media coverage since November. But on the sort of grassroots level, yes, people are extremely angry. And now putting everything onto the Conservative Party. As a local councillor, you have no say over what happens in national government, but on the doorsteps, people will just tar you with the same brush.
Does that mean, in your opinion, that the Prime Minister at this point is a sitting duck, that the scandal's already been created, the public mood is now set, and regardless of what this report does or doesn't say, given that it's so heavily redacted anyway, people are going to cry foul, that actually the Prime Minister's position is already untenable?
I think trust is fractured. And whether we can ever gain that back, or certainly in the next sort of 5-10 years, remains to be seen. And once you lose that trust with the public, it's a very dangerous slope downwards. There are local elections coming up in May, and I think they're going to be really, really tricky. And it's for councillors like myself, it's incumbent upon us to try and go out there and do our best for our constituents, which is not helped by the ongoing saga in Number 10.
Now, you've been a SPAD or a special advisor at the highest levels of government. Does this sort of party culture strike you as familiar in any way, shape or form? Is there a culture in Whitehall and in government departments of late-night drinks, regardless of whether there are pandemics on or not? Or is this very much a sort of Johnsonian-era development?
I think you'll hear lots of different stories with different departments, but certainly I worked at the Home Office and wasn't party to any culture such as that. And I think, and I've said this before, in sort of 18 months I was there, maybe 3 times we'd had a drink after work, which was a drink after a really long day, and we went home. Now, granted, it was not in a pandemic. I may well have just been too old for people to come and invite me. People at Number 10 are an awful lot younger, but it certainly was not a culture that I was aware of.
Interesting you say that, because people have criticised the team around Boris Johnson, saying he could actually be a good leader because he's so popular with the public, he's a fantastic orator, he just needs the right people around him. And you reinforced there this idea that the culture in Downing Street is a lot younger, and there they were, loading up a suitcase, taking it down to the local convenience store, wheeling it back full of booze. It does strike me more of sixth form common room than the functionings of central government.
Well, that's right. They've not, in the majority, will not have been elected to a parish council, district council, town council. They're not beholden to the public and to their opinion. And you have to start looking at that when you are an elected representative, as you well know, that what you do is seen by everybody and you have to lead the way. And I think that is always a problem when you don't have that experience.
Now, we are, of course, waiting for that report to be published imminently. When we do, we're going to provide as many details as quickly as possible. But if that report comes out and exonerates Boris Johnson, he says, I see now that the offices around me, I mean, Number 10 is a hugely cavernous, labyrinthine place, isn't it? He's not omnipresent within all the realms of 10 Downing Street. If it turns out that he says this shouldn't have happened, it wasn't under my watch, and heads are going to roll, should he be granted a reprieve?
Well, I think that's now down to the members of Parliament. We have to wait and see what does come out. We are in this really tricky position that we know the report is there. We don't know what's in it. We don't know how it's going to be reacted to in the chamber this afternoon when the Prime Minister makes a statement. So I think we need to look at all of those in balance, and then it is down to MPs to decide whether that is enough for them.
I mean, surely the point is, it's all very well MPs sort of saying, I'm going to wait to see what's in the report and then decide. That sounds to me, having worked in politics for a long time, they're licking their fingers, sticking them up to the wind, seeing which direction public opinion is going to go in, and then they'll decide whether to crucify the leader to save their own skins. That's all rather venal, isn't it? Surely if Boris Johnson is a good leader and they support his leadership, they should support him, or else not.
Well, they should, and I think it's been used as an excuse so far for a lot of people to not take a position on it. I know from speaking to a number of MPs that their inboxes have been full of people who are really, really unhappy, and I should suspect that that is cross-party. But I can see that some of the newer MPs who haven't been around very long don't really know what the process is like for choosing a leader. I've been there since 2004. I've seen this process go through many times, but some of them won't have done that. So I think there's timing that needs to be taken into account. They will be talking to older colleagues who have been there for a longer time so that they can get the feeling of how all of this works and what you have to do as a team.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of timing, because I was about to ask you, with this burgeoning crisis in Ukraine, you've got Boris Johnson and Liz Truss travelling to Ukraine later this week, and Boris Johnson due to have a call with Vladimir Putin to tell him to step away from the brink. This really isn't time for a big reshuffle, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, there is never a good time for that to happen, to be perfectly honest. But this is a really tricky time. The situation with Russia and Ukraine is so febrile that we need our leaders to be, steadfast in going out there and talking to them. So no, right now is not the time. But any motion to remove the Prime Minister will take some time. It's not going to be done and dusted in a couple of days. So we all need to look at that balancing act.
Is it also ironically possible that Partygate could end up being beneficial as Boris Johnson, in order to secure and pin down his legacy and make good with the public again, will actually start working hard and focusing on delivering, for example, Brexit dividends? He's announced a big Brexit bill today. He's starting to look and sound more statesmanlike when it comes to the machinations of geopolitics. Perhaps, just perhaps, if he's able to survive this report, he might be a better Prime Minister for it.
He could well be. He is an extremely good campaigner. No one will take that away from him. But what he does need to do is refocus his efforts on the issues that are affecting the country and look at his team surrounding him. I think that is vitally important if he's going to survive going forward.
I mean, one would think as well, to put together a coordinated, consolidated legacy of proposals, that you need a very harmonious cabinet. But we're already hearing murmurings of people preparing their own campaigns, maybe building secret websites to push for their own little leadership hopes. Following this sort of scandal, there's always going to be a small fallout, and surely some of that will be creating divisions in a cabinet who, quite frankly, we need to be working together in single voice.
Yes, you do. You do need them working together in a single voice, but it's always good to have different points of view. There's no point having a cabinet that just agrees with the leader and just agrees with each other. Now, politicians are extremely ambitious. They'll tell you otherwise, but they are, and I'm sure that they all have plans for the future. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think ambition is really good. But what you do need to do is come together and understand where your differences are and how you can work around them.
And if Boris Johnson does appear to be facing a vote of no confidence, and you had the ability to submit a letter, of course you're a councillor, so it's not quite the same thing, but later on it might be that it goes out to the membership, which direction would your vote go?
Which direction would my vote go? In a vote of no confidence. I have been quite clear over the last 3 weeks that I do not have confidence in him leading our party.
And who would you want to succeed him?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. Let's see. We've had so many names coming into the fore. I think Penny Mordaunt is really interesting. I think Tom Tugendhat, also very interesting, and a neighbour of my council division. So I'd like to see what they put forward.
I mean, both there are MPs who haven't really held the highest offices in the land, which is normally the prerogative, isn't it, or the protocol for people throwing their hat into the ring when it comes to leadership contests.
It is, but they're also not tarred with any of the problems that have happened. And sometimes you need a bit of a clean sweep to come through, someone with some different thoughts, which may well then help to bind the party together.
If we do find that there are over 54 MPs queuing up outside Graham Brady's office to submit letters, and the Prime Minister does indeed face a vote of no confidence, how quickly can that process be executed? How quickly will we get a new Prime Minister? Or do you think there'll be an appetite in the Conservative Party to hold back and wait until after those May local elections?
I think there will be an appetite to wait. It can happen fairly quickly if Sir Graham Brady does reach the magic 54. And we've seen this in Theresa May's time, that the vote of no confidence came to the chamber, I think, within sort of 2 days. So it was relatively quick.
Yeah, Claire, I'm going to interrupt you because I think we've now got emerging details of that report, which has just been published. So let's cross to the news desk now for an update.
Thanks, Alex. And yes, some breaking news for you. Sue Gray's report into alleged Downing Street lockdown rule breaking has just been published on the government's website. The senior civil servant's findings have been pared back while the Met Police continue their own investigations. Well, the Prime Minister is going to be giving a statement to the House of Commons at 3:30 today. Of course, we'll be broadcasting that live for you here on GB News, so don't miss that. We'll bring you all the latest on the story as it develops.
You're with Alex Phillips on GB News, on TV and DAB Radio. We're now going to cross live to Tom Harwood, who is outside 10 Downing Street, to give us the latest now that Sue Gray's report has been published. Tom.
Well, Alex, I'm holding Sue Gray's report here in my hand. It is 12 pages long. It's a lot shorter than I think a lot of people were expecting. 8 pages of the official report with a few pages of annexes. I could read you the conclusion now. The gatherings within the scope of this investigation are spread over a 20-month period, a period that has been unique in recent times in terms of the complexity and breadth of the demands on public servants and indeed the general public. The whole of the country rose to the challenge. Ministers, special advisers and the civil service, of which I am proud to be a part, were a key and dedicated part of that national effort. However, as I have noted, a number of these gatherings should not have been allowed to take place or develop in the way that they did. There is significant learning to be drawn from these events, which must be addressed immediately across government. This does not need to wait for the police investigations to be concluded. So there we have it, Sue Gray saying in her conclusions that immediate changes need to be made. What the Prime Minister will say in his response to that conclusion, we will only have around 1 hour to wait to hear. Undoubtedly, the Prime Minister will be under significant pressure to come to that dispatch box in the House of Commons and lay out changes. Changes to the operation in Number 10, changes to the way that the civil service is run, changes that can materially be enacted even before that police investigation has concluded. That's the recommendation of Sue Gray.
Yeah, Tom, I mean, it sounds to me as though it's going to be fairly condemning in how it portrays at least a culture going on in 10 Downing Street. Whether or not we get more detail over the culpability of the Prime Minister, we will find out, I suppose. We may not find out from this report. We have got people onto that right now to pull out as much detail as possible. What has the mood been like in Westminster today? Are people starting to relax about this, or is everybody sort of in a febrile atmosphere and on tenterhooks, ready to hand in their letters?
I have to say the mood is a lot calmer than it was just 2 weeks ago when we had that Tuesday night and Wednesday morning when it really reached fever pitch, when you had the so-called pork pie plot, when you had the defection of Christian Wakeford. That was the moment, I think, of really peak drama. Since then, the longer this has run on, the more people have taken a step back perhaps, and it seems that the mood has mellowed somewhat. I think that in that conclusion that we just heard to Sue Gray's report, it does seem to be slightly more balanced than perhaps the detractors of Boris Johnson were hoping. There are elements of light and shade within this report, and certainly there'll be bits for both camps, those in favour of the Prime Minister and those against the Prime Minister, to champion. Does it seem like that absolute significant moment? Does it seem like that flicking of a switch at the end of Boris Johnson's career? I'm not so sure. Reading that conclusion just now makes me think that potentially there is a way out for Boris Johnson here, and I don't get the sense that we're about to experience a flood of letters.
Tom, thank you very much. Keep us updated, as I'm sure you will, and stop poring over that report, because we want to know all the detail. Well, we're joined now by Home and Security Editor Mark White. Mark.
Yeah, been poring over that report, as you were asking Tom to do as well. Page 7, I think, sticks out, as far as I'm concerned, I think, with some of the more pointed criticism that Sue Gray has. In it, she says, with regard to what she has found in relation to these parties and events, she says, against the backdrop of the pandemic, when the government was asking citizens to accept far-reaching restrictions... Sorry about this.
That's like this is breaking live news for you.
Yeah, that's the problem when I'm getting...
Some of the behaviour surrounding these gatherings is difficult to justify. There you go. I've got it on my own computer here. I mean, that is relatively damning, isn't it? Essentially saying that the culture, at the very least, is in stark contrast to the law of the land at the time, the law that Boris Johnson himself was dictating from behind a lectern almost on a nightly basis, and says at least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also of the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. She goes on to say, at times it seems there was too little thought given to what was happening across the country in considering the appropriateness of some of these gatherings, the risk they presented to public health and how they might appear to the public. There were failures of leadership and judgment by different parts of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office at different times. Some of the events should not have been allowed to take place. Other events should not have been allowed to develop as they did. She says the excessive consumption of alcohol is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. Steps must be taken to ensure that every government department has a clear and robust policy in place covering the consumption of alcohol in the workplace.
And she then says the use of the garden at Number 10 Downing Street should be primarily for the use of the Prime Minister and the private residence of Number 10 and Number 11 Downing Street. During the pandemic, it was often used as an extension of the workplace as a more COVID-secure means of holding group meetings in a ventilated space. This was a sensible, she says, measure that staff appreciated, but the garden was also used for gatherings without clear authorisation or oversight. This was not appropriate, she says. Any official access to the space, including for meetings, should be by invitation only and in controlled environment.
Yeah, it's this next part, actually, that's just jumped out to me, which really does raise concerns about the culture inside Number 10, saying that some staff actually wanted to raise concerns about the behaviours they witnessed at work, but at times felt unable to do so. No member of staff should feel unable to report or challenge poor conduct where they witness it. There should be easier ways for staff to raise such concerns informally outside of the management's chain.
And she says the number of staff working in Number 10 Downing Street has steadily increased in recent years in terms of size, scale and range of responsibility. It's now more akin to a small government department than purely a dedicated Prime Minister's office. The structure, she says, that support the smooth operation of Downing Street, however, have not evolved sufficiently to meet the demands of this expansion. She goes on to say the leadership structures and fragmented and complicated and it sometimes, she said, led to the blurring of lines and accountability. Too much responsibility and expectation is placed on the senior official whose principal function is the direct support of the Prime Minister. This should be addressed, she says, as a matter of priority.
I mean, let's do an appraisal of that, because that brings us to the conclusion which Tom Harwood neatly introduced us to at the very beginning as soon as that report dropped. It seems to me no names are named. There's no direct accusation the Prime Minister himself organised these parties. There's no reference to whether he attended these parties. But what it is saying, I think, in very strident terms, is there is a culture of excessive alcohol consumption, of one rule for us, another rule for everybody else, of a sort of oversized, bloated and irresponsible department surrounding the Prime Minister, and misuse of the property and misuse of the site of 10 Downing Street. I mean, it seems to me that this is going to be quite hard for the Prime Minister to survive.
Yeah, there's no doubt by the tone of the report and what Sue Gray is saying here, she feels that the way in which the gardens and other spaces within Downing Street were used, the functions, the parties that shouldn't really have taken place, she's clearly critical there. What she's not been able to do is to go in forensic detail into those different events that we know took place on the 15th of May, I think it was, in 2020. Other events, some 16, I think, we're talking about over a period of time between 2020 and 2021, when we were in varying degrees of lockdown. She's not been able to do that because, in a way, she's been hobbled by the Metropolitan Police, asking her to just make minimal reference to individual events that they are investigating. So that's meant really that she can't go into any of the detail on those events that we want to know about. The event, for instance, where 100 people were invited by the Prime Minister's principal private secretary. And of course, we know that in the end, some 30 people turned up, including the Prime Minister and Carrie Johnson at that event. A number of other events that took place either in Downing Street proper or in the garden outside. We can't get into the minutiae of those events, but we want to obviously find out exactly what she's had to say and what the Metropolitan Police will have to say at the end of the day. I think it's clear her general conclusion is things went on that shouldn't have gone on, given what the rest of the public were being asked to do at a time of great concern over the potential risk to the public in health terms.
I mean, yeah, pulling out two parts here which really stand out to me. The very first general finding that she makes is saying that these gatherings, or some of the behaviour surrounding these gatherings, is difficult to justify. She's essentially saying here that whatever excuse the Prime Minister may give for why those parties took place, whether he knew of them or not, that it's very, very hard to say that they were permitted, that they were appropriate given that there was a pandemic going on. And then, of course, she goes on in point 4 to talk about the excessive consumption of alcohol. Using the word excessive is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. That is pretty damning.
It's certainly critical in terms of the fact that she can only at this stage give that overview about the culture and what went on there in the broadest of terms. When we get to the point where we can talk about those individual events in more detail, and when the police have their say with a view clearly to looking at the potential for criminal sanctions, and we believe those will be fixed penalty notices in the first instance. If someone, of course, appeals that and decides to contest the issuing of a fixed penalty notice, it could go to a magistrate's court. But we're expecting that it will be fixed penalty notices. But if you get to the point where the Metropolitan Police are handing out fines to individual members of the government, staff, potentially the Prime Minister, we don't know. I mean, normally, from what the Metropolitan Police was saying in its early statement with regard to what the potential sanctions are likely to be, it said just because they're investigating a number of different parties doesn't mean that all of those parties will be subject to criminal sanction, and indeed doesn't mean that all those in attendance will be subject to fixed penalty notices. So that might mean that what they're going to do is follow what has become custom and practice with a view to investigating these larger scale parties during the pandemic, where they've gone after the organisers. So does that mean, for instance, it's someone like the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister who sent out the invitations? Is he classed as an organiser, whereas the Prime Minister is just an attendee? I think whatever, this is going to be very awkward for Boris Johnson, given what Sue Gray has said here. It's clear she is critical of the way in which these events have taken place. They shouldn't have taken place when the rest of the country, as she said, was abiding by these strict lockdown procedures to try to ensure that everybody's health was safeguarded.
Mark, thank you ever so much. Well, there you go, folks. The report, the infamous Sue Gray report, we've all been on tenterhooks waiting to receive, has finally dropped. You will be able to read it yourself. It is now being made available to the public. It is, of course, going to be on GB News social media platforms and on our website. And you can stay tuned to GB News as we continue to dissect some of the allegations being made by Sue Gray, some of the findings, I should say, made by Sue Gray in that report. Findings such as saying some of the behaviour surrounding these gatherings is difficult to justify. Talking about at times there seems to have been too little thought given to what was happening across the country and considering the appropriateness of some of these gatherings, and also saying the excessive consumption of alcohol is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. Well, I'm joined now by Michael Fabricant, who is a Conservative MP for Lichfield. Michael, you've been from the beginning a sort of very robust defender of Boris Johnson, but this doesn't really sound very good, does it?
Well, I was saying to Tom Harwood about 2 weeks ago in this very studio that what there needs to be, in my view, are tighter controls in number 10 Downing Street itself, and that means having its own government department, an Office of Prime Minister, and not being part of the wider Cabinet Office, where all the management are based in a completely different building in Whitehall. And that seems to be very much what Sue Gray is saying. And I think now the question will be, what actually is the responsibility that lays directly at the feet of Boris Johnson, and what lays at the feet of the civil service itself? Now, this is not blaming the civil service, but it is being realistic about the situation as reported by Sue Gray.
I mean, my previous guest, Claire Pearsall, who has worked as a SPAD at the highest levels of government departments, said, well, this drinking culture is abnormal. This is not something she's seen when she was a SPAD at the Home Office. The fact that the word excessive is in there, excessive consumption of alcohol, suggests to me that there's a load of drunks running the country in Downing Street. Surely that is not acceptable. If I came to work and started popping vino in the studios of GB News, I think I'd be on a very short tenure indeed. Is this going to make you think again about whether the Prime Minister should be in position? Because surely the buck does stop with Boris, and he does have a reputation for being a bit of a bon vivant.
Well, it does seem that this drinking culture in 10, 11 and 12 Downing Street is something that has been going on even since back in Gordon Brown's day, certainly in David Cameron's day, where people used to have a Friday night drink when the boss had gone home, because, of course, the Prime Minister is either in his constituency or at Chequers. So it all comes back down to, where does the buck stop? Does it stop with the Prime Minister? Should the Prime Minister know if there are people drinking after he's gone? Or could you argue that, in fact, that the civil servants didn't have tight enough controls about what was going on in that building? And that's the point. The senior management are based in 70 Whitehall, which is a separate building altogether. And Sue Gray makes the powerful point that maybe there hasn't been enough control at all of the civil service in Downing Street. And now, because, there are over 100 offices, there are hundreds of people employed in that complex, it should be a government department in its own right. Something, incidentally, that Tony Blair suggested, but sadly didn't put into place.
I'm going to draw a stark contrast here. You're talking about the civil service. I'm going to draw a stark contrast between this culture that's being reported by Sue Gray in 10 Downing Street and trying to imagine that existing under, say, Theresa May, whose greatest crime was running through a wheat field. It's hard to imagine Theresa May as even opening a bottle of Schlur in 10 Downing Street, whereas this is Boris Johnson, who's often spoken about his adoration for cheese and claret, contributing to the poor health that wound him up in hospital with COVID.
Let's get this straight. I mean, there are plenty of official receptions that go on at number 10 Downing Street, and I've seen Theresa May, quite properly, with everyone else, drinking either champagne, or maybe it was Schlur, but anyway, it looked like champagne. No, the whole question is, was the environment right that in the evening on a Friday night, you gave the GB News analogy. Now, I used to work years ago for the BBC, and there was a BBC club, and I think there still is a BBC club, and we all used to go to it at the end of a hard day's work. This is what seemed to be happening on the Friday nights with these mythical, but actually true, cases where people were walking along with wine which they bought at Tesco or the Co-op and taking into Downing Street.
But the point is here, isn't it, that this was during a time where the rest of us, we weren't allowed to go to the pub.
Yeah.
I mean, we were all being told to work from home. We were locked up in our houses. We weren't seeing loved ones. I mean, whether or not on a Friday night we opened our bottle of supermarket wine with our, nearest and dearest who we may be living with is one thing. But this is a very willful and deliberate plan to go regularly to a local convenience store to fill up a suitcase with wine for the express purposes of drinking it on the premises because pubs aren't open. That is clearly a very knowledgeable circumvention of the law of the land in the exact offices making those laws.
Yes, you're right. I mean, from a legal point of view, absolutely indefensible. And we will find out from the Metropolitan Police what the consequences will be. Just trying to put my mind into the mindset, though, of those people who are engaging in this, they might well have thought it was still against the law, but they might well have thought, well, look, we've been working together all day in these cramped offices. We're not inviting outsiders. We're letting our hair down. Yeah, breaking the law maybe, or they might have thought it wasn't breaking the law because they were in effect a work bubble. I mean, that's something that the Metropolitan Police now are going to try and resolve. But of course, Sue Gray was absolutely right to say, you know, in the end, it was out of control because people were using the garden willy-nilly. They hadn't been invited. The controls, the civil service controls in Downing Street. I mean, you know, today at 3:30, the Prime Minister will be addressing the Commons. At 6:30, incidentally, he will be addressing the Conservative Parliamentary Party. But you can bet your bottom dollar that Keir Starmer will say, well, you should have known if people were using the garden. But to use your Theresa May point, you know, you wouldn't know if they were in Chequers at the time, some 45 miles away, and people then spilled out or whatever into the garden. You know, the civil servants in control of Downing Street should have known and stopped it, except there are no civil servants in control of Downing Street as such, because, as I said, the senior ones are based in a separate building. That's why Sue Gray's argument that actually you need to have a separate government department for the Office of Prime Minister, that needs to be in force, in control, and this sort of thing wouldn't then have happened.
There's going to be two schools of thoughts on this. There'll be those who regard that the blowing off of steam by, you know, people working hard during the course of the day who share a working environment very intimately in office space, and having a drink on a Friday is potentially excusable. But this was during a crisis. And when you're running a government during a crisis, surely you've got to be vigilant and prepared to act at any given moment. And yes, there was a big pandemic going on. There were all sorts of policies being made rapidly to keep up to date with the latest scientific information. Very, you know, unprecedented laws and regulations, the likes of which this country's never seen before. Do you think that given those circumstances, that there should have been potentially a little bit more sort of probity and sympathy with the public and restraint exhibited? Or is this much like Boris Johnson's own hero, Winston Churchill, who, of course, Boris has written a biography on Churchill, who famously would neck a bottle of champagne by lunchtime while running the country during a war?
If we're to believe it.
I mean, is this a case of blowing off steam under extremely pressured circumstances, or is this just, this should not be taking place at the heart of government?
No, it was a terrible look. It was potentially against the law. That we'll find out when the Met Police make their report. It shouldn't have happened because of the look and because of the anger, the natural anger that it's caused amongst the people, you know, population who've lost loved ones, couldn't visit loved ones in hospitals, and so on and so forth. It's just, you know, I always see two sides of the argument. Maybe that's my weakness. I do know they were working hard. I do know that most of these events happened on a Friday night when they had finished work. Other events happened when it was leaving parties and people briefly had a drink and then went back to work. I can tell you from friends of mine in America and Australia, who incidentally are undergoing lockdown that we don't have in the UK, that they think Cakegate, as they like to call it, is crazy. They can't understand why we're obsessed with it all, and they think that Boris has made all the right calls because bars are shut in Canada and most parts of Europe as we speak. I think we'll wait to see what the Prime Minister says at 3:30. I hope he'll show some remorse, but whether, you know, you can really pin the blame on a Prime Minister who wouldn't have even been there or known what junior civil servants were up to is, I think, stretching it a bit.
Well, I'm going to give you a little reprieve to check your text messages and give the viewers an update of what has been said in that report. Of course, the Sue Gray report has now landed. It is available to the public to read, and you can follow the GB News social media accounts and on our website to link directly to that. In the report, in which she gives the context of it being a pandemic where the country is living under the most stringent and unprecedented of regulations, she goes on to say that at least some of the gatherings in question represent a serious failure to observe not just the high standards expected of those working at the heart of government, but also of the standards expected of the entire British population at the time. She says, at times it seems there was too little thought given to what was happening across the country in considering the appropriateness of some of these gatherings, the risks they presented to public health and how they might appear to the public. There were failures of leadership and judgment by different parts of Number 10 and the Cabinet Office at different times. Some of the events should not have been allowed to take place. Other events should not have been allowed to develop as they did. And then, quite strikingly, the excessive consumption of alcohol is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time. Steps must be taken to ensure that every government department has a clear and robust policy in place covering the consumption of alcohol in the workplace. Now, Michael, I'm going to come back to you. Is your phone abuzz with messages? Can you feel it going off in your pocket as MPs all start colluding in WhatsApp groups of what do you think and what should I do? Is this going to be a situation where a bit of groupthink rolls into town and someone's going to lead the way and pioneer the decision that may eventually seal the fate of the Prime Minister? Or will MPs be not working in chorus and actually doing what they said and deciding for themselves, based upon the Gray report, how they should now?
Well, those who don't like Boris will be delighted with this report, both members of Parliament and also people out there in general. I think others will be taking a more balanced view and will be waiting to see how the Prime Minister performs at 3:30 in Parliament, whether he takes these criticisms seriously, though, as I say, whether you can lay them actually at the Prime Minister's door when he wasn't even attending most of these because he was miles away is another matter. And I think as well, it'll be very interesting to be present at 6:30, which I will be, at a private meeting. Well, it won't be that private because all these things get leaked. But anyway, a private meeting, it's supposed to be, of the parliamentary party with the Prime Minister to hear what the Prime Minister has to say to us and also take questions, I hope, from various colleagues. I think it's important, if I can give advice to the Prime Minister, that although, he shouldn't accept blame, at the end of the day, as President Roosevelt, I think it was, had on his desk, the buck stops here. So he has to take some responsibility and apologise, yet again, as he already has.
Michael, thank you so much for coming and joining me in the studio and giving your snap analysis on this. I'll now let you go and read for yourself in depth the Sue Gray report and start your plottings and discussions in WhatsApp groups, as I'm sure you are going to be doing alongside lots of other Conservative MPs. Well, there you go. Remember, stay tuned as we cover the details of this breaking story. The Sue Gray report has finally landed. It's available for public view. We have, of course, got the details and the link to that on our social media and on our website. And just to remind you, this is a heavily redacted report following the instigation of a Metropolitan Police investigation into goings-on at Downing Street. They say that giving details, naming people and perhaps outlining the culpability of Boris Johnson could prejudice their own investigation. But she has published her general findings, and very strident findings they were too, basically saying that in the Partygate row, Sue Gray said the Downing Street garden was used for gatherings without clear authorisation or oversight, and this was not appropriate. It's just one of the findings she has in her report. Well, I'm joined now by Henry Hill. Do you find this report shocking at all? Is this what you expected, given that Boris has a bit of a reputation for being a bon vivant? And there's been a lot of whisperings and murmurings about the sort of culture that might have been growing in Downing Street.
I mean, I think most people who've been waiting for the build-up of this report, this is a damp squib. I mean, for understandable reasons, perhaps. Sue Gray has taken the decision to remove any reference to the events that are being investigated by the police, which obviously takes out, if you like, the most serious breaches of the rules, and that leaves us really with what comes across as quite a dry HR document, basically. There are criticisms in there about the use of the Downing Street garden, the drinking culture and so on, and there's claims that blame rests at different points with different parts of the Downing Street hierarchy, but there's no smoking gun that's going to push Conservative MPs to decide that this is what does for Boris Johnson, which, when this process started, is what a lot of people thought the Sue Gray report would turn out to be.
I agree with you that there's not much detail in this report, but she does use some pretty strident language, saying that the behaviour surrounding these gatherings is different difficult to justify. And then goes on again, I've mentioned it a few times, talking about the excessive consumption of alcohol in a professional workplace at the heart of government. I mean, whether or not we've got to the granular detail of who was doing what, when, where, why, and with whose knowledge, it is clearly painting a picture here of an operation in the highest office of the land that, quite frankly, is not only in stark contrast to what was being asked of the public at the time, but probably in stark contrast to what most people expect the culture of 10 Downing Street to be.
I think, actually, I still want to distinguish between those two things, because for me, the problem here is that there was a breach, that these were being done at a time when the country was being asked to make extraordinary sacrifices. For me, that's the serious problem. That's what really needs to be got to. And I'm slightly concerned about the idea that bleeds over into a more general HR point, because, of course, the claim about excessive consumption of alcohol, from what I've seen of the report, and I have only had an opportunity to skim it so far, they're not really talking about excessive consumption of alcohol during working hours. They're not talking about people getting sloshed at their desks before making crucial decisions. It's about parties, leaving dues that were held out of hours in the Downing Street building. Now, the problem with those is that they were against the rules and that they were in contrast with the lockdown regulations. But I don't think if anyone who's been to an office party that, has been held in the office after hours considers that to be part of the office drinking culture.
But most offices don't seem to have 15 parties during the course of a year. You might have your annual Christmas party. And yes, of course, people might go to the pub after work. But the point is, people weren't able to go to the pub after work.
But that's the problem. That's the thing that we really need to focus in on, is the fact that these were being held illegally at a time when everyone else was being asked to make huge sacrifices, and we all did. And I really want the focus of anger to be on that. And actually, one of the things that slightly aggravates me about the report is the way that it seems, perhaps because of the limitations that Sue Gray was facing, it comes across as a more general kind of HR issue. And the problem with that from the perspective of accountability is that if you're the Prime Minister or you're the senior people in Downing Street, that's exactly what you want. You want to be able to point to a general culture where there's lots of blame to go around, where different people made bad decisions at different times, and then you can just promise to reform it. And you evade that kind of hard accountability for the fact that these were happening illegally, and the responsibility for that goes right to the top. That's what concerns me about this report.
We do know that Boris Johnson is going to be addressing Parliament following the release of this report at about 3:30 in half an hour's time. Do you think there's anything he can say to Parliament to wriggle his way out of this? Because the opposition now are going to be, they're going to smell blood. They're going to go for the jugular, aren't they? And there's going to be a lot of hullabaloo calling for his resignation. While meanwhile, I'd imagine Conservative MPs are going to be waiting to see the direction of travel of public opinion and how the media handle this before they determine whether or not their leader is a sitting duck and needs to be gotten rid of to protect their own seats, or whether he can survive this. What do you think the Prime Minister needs to say and do now to save his bacon?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has always needed to take full responsibility for ultimately what happens in Downing Street, which is both his place of living and place of work. But I think that what he will say is, one, the most serious allegations, he'll be very glad about this, the most serious allegations have been farmed out to the police, so he can continue to say that they need to wait for the police to be allowed to investigate, and Sue Gray has decided not to prejudice the police investigation. He has already said that he believes in an overall general overhaul of the Downing Street operation, and this report will be grist to that mill. He will say, I will fully take on board Sue Gray's recommendations and change the culture of Downing Street. But I think that for now he'll be able to wriggle out of taking personal responsibility because of the way this has been framed and because the most serious allegations have been taken elsewhere. And so while Labour will go for him, Tory MPs will be waiting for that sort of critical moment that will allow them to go over the top. And I don't think that this report is going to deliver it.
Henry, thank you so much for coming in and joining me today and giving me your insight into this emerging story. Fascinating it is too. We've all been waiting for the Gray report. It's finally landed, much shorter and heavily redacted. Of course, the Prime Minister is going to be addressing Parliament in half an hour. We will be bringing that to you live. But as storm clouds gather over number 10, should we have a look at the weather forecast and see if they're gathering over Britain in general? That's it from me. The briefing is coming up next. Do stay tuned as we continue to keep our pulse on the going-ons of Westminster and bring you the latest from this fascinating and breaking news story.
Hello again. Storm Corrie is clearing away, but it's still windy out there. Cold wind as well, slowly easing through the day. Sunny spells for many, certainly in the east. A few showers in the west. There is that storm system that brought the damage across Scotland overnight. The low pressure heading away, but bringing some very strong winds to Germany and Belgium today. Behind it, the isobars slowly opening up, but as I said, still quite a cold and brisk wind blowing out there, and blowing showers into Wales, west and north of Scotland, some patchy rain coming into the west of Northern Ireland as well. Elsewhere, most places dry, just 1 or 2 showers in southwest England, and many eastern areas dry, fine and sunny. But it is cold, and it feels especially cold in the east where the winds are stronger. It feels closer to freezing when you add on the wind. Now, we're going to see a bit more rain trickling into Scotland and Northern Ireland through this evening. That will slowly spread its way southwards into parts of the Midlands and Wales by morning. So a cloudy night, a damp night, and things turning milder as well. Early in the night, we could see temperatures down to 3 or 4 degrees, but by dawn, most places up at 7 or 8 Celsius. So a mild day to come on Tuesday. Quite a grey start with outbreaks of rain, and it will be windy again across northern Scotland. Now, not as windy as through the weekend, but we could still see gusts of 50 to 60 miles an hour, and because of those recent storms, that could still also bring some disruption. So there is a yellow warning in place across northern Scotland, some brightness across southern Scotland, northern England, and look at the temperatures up to 11 to maybe 13 Celsius, so really quite mild. Stays blustery across northern Scotland with further showers through the evening. It stays damp across Wales, Northern Ireland, parts of the Midlands with rain and drizzle here and there. Clearer skies again across southern Scotland and northeast England. The winds will continue to be a feature of the weather this week, although not as strong as at the weekend. Fairly mild for the next few days, but a colder spell on Friday.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints over a drink.